Welcome to the Stories in EDU podcast, the show where we talk with real educators and hear their powerful impact. Their stories will grab you, inspire you, and show you the reach of the work we do. And now, the Bretzmann Group presents your hosts, Josh Gauthier and Mandy Taylor.
Welcome back to Stories in EDU. We are so excited to be back after a little bit of a break this summer, as of course all educators need a little bit of time off to relax and re-energize for a new school year. And with the launch of a new school year, we have the launch of an exciting book, which we're going to talk about today as we relaunch the podcast. Mandy, this is pretty exciting to have this opportunity to continue sharing stories of educators in a couple of different ways.
You know, this is our first day back, and so I'm feeling that kind of like first day tired, but this summer has been so busy with prep and everything. It's been kind of a break, but I'm so excited to get back because even today, my kids have stories, my personal kids. I was helping out with pre-K kids on the playground, and this one little boy just kept coming up to me and he kept going, "It's too long. It's too long." And I was like, "What, honey?" He's like, "It's too long." And I was like, "I feel you, buddy." This little 4-year-old, he just kept grabbing my hand. "It's too long." He wanted to go home so bad, but they were so tired. It was so sweet. But the kids were telling stories, and I just really do think that the stories of education is where the magic of what we do each day with kids and schools and content, but really just the people. So I'm excited about what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm excited to have Jason here, and I'm ready to get going.
All right, let's do it. Jason, of course, you are one of the creators of the podcast, and you are an accomplished author and storyteller and teacher, and we're excited to have you share a little bit about the newest project related to Stories in EDU.
Well, thank you, Josh and Mandy. And I just got to start by saying I love what you do with the podcast. I love the opportunity to hear all these stories and get the connections that you have with these people onto this platform so that other people can hear the stories. And so we've gone, to an additional direction now where we have a book, the Stories in EDU book, called Stories in EDU,
Woo!
Sail with the Fleet. Yeah, it's so exciting.
It really is.
I tell the story in the introduction how, years ago we wrote a book that was sort of organized through the internet after I connected with the Flip Class community on Twitter, and I said, hey, you know what? Not everybody's on Twitter, but everybody who's an educator will read a book. I mean, we love books, right? We've got lots of books. My wife laments the fact that we have so many books that I've read the first 100 pages of. But, you just got to get the gist. But so we went ahead and published the Flipping 2.0 book, and that led with Kristen Daniels' chapter in that from Minnesota to personalized PD in that book. And then we started talking about how do we make this personalized PD happen, and we created the game of stories. And this isn't just a big commercial, right? But there's, it's going somewhere. So we created the game of stories so that we could start the conversation. And I was standing out in the hallway because I have the wonderful benefit of working across the hallway from Kenny Bosch, who works with us and who's a co-author of this book. And we were talking about all this stuff, and he said, it's about the stories. It's not always about the flipping or the best practice or the technology or whatever. He said, it's really about all the stories that we get to hear. And then we started talking about the podcast, and again, we came back to two things. Educators love books, and it's all about the stories. So he said, well, what if we got some more stories and we put them together so that people could read them? Like, just like Twitter. Not everybody was on Twitter, and not everybody would listen to a podcast, although everybody who's listening to this one is fantastic. So we said, let's put together a book so that we can share those stories and, amplify those voices and celebrate the successes and, what we might call learning opportunities, for lack of a better term, of all those educators out there. And so this was our first go at it. Somewhere inside the book, it's called First Voyage, with the implication that the second wind is not far behind the first voyage. But it's just a wonderful book, and it's the stories of real educators, just like this podcast.
Absolutely. And I think it's something may have mentioned on the podcast before, definitely with other people, but I believe there's this really strong, this hardwired tie in our DNA to storytelling and how we react, and how our early ancestors, that was how we shared everything that was important, was through a story. And I think because of that, there's something really powerful when we can hear something in a story format. So if you want to talk about trying new things in your classroom, the best way is to tell a story about how that went and the lessons we can learn. And it's just a beautiful way of enriching this profession and sharing what's going on.
Right on. And, as you're saying that, I'm thinking back to when I used to teach you. I'm a history, social studies, now government teacher. And I remember trying to get my sophomore students to understand how revered George Washington was by telling them, hey, that, first of all, let's define revere. But, talking about how important he was. And they didn't really get it until I told the story about how, there was this rebellion that was fomenting among the troops because they weren't getting paid. And then he came in front of them to try to, quash the rebellion and say, hey, look, you can't be doing this. We're going to lose our country. And then he pulls out this letter that he wants to read, and then he pulls out his glasses and puts them on. And noticing the murmur in the crowd, he kind of looks around and he says, forgive me, gentlemen, but I have grown old in your service. And the story goes that there were these generals in the military that were openly weeping because here they were asking for a few dollars, and here was their General Washington, giving his entire life to this country, and who were they to ask for a few more bucks? And so ended the rebellion. And you could just see the students sitting on the edge of their seats going, tell us more about this. Mm-hmm. And like, you get this as history, right? But it was a story, and that's what we do. We're great storytellers.
As an elementary person, I just moved into a new position in our district as a literacy specialist. So I'm working, I get to kind of focus in on literacy. And that's one of the things that I have always been so passionate about, is being able to connect the right book with the right reader. And I think that there's just so much power in finding stories that you either connect with, or that you can learn from, or that you can see not only yourself in, but others as well. And I think that that's what's fascinating to me about a book like this and this process, is that, I started blogging several years ago just as a way to reflect on my own practice. And I enjoy writing, but I never really considered myself a writer, and so the work that I've been able to do with the writing project and really working with teachers, and then when I started blogging, I really was able to kind of understand the power of being able to write well and have people connect with stories. And I think that that's why elementary school, it's one of the reasons it's so fun, is because it's so natural for us to find children's books to weave into our science lessons, our math lessons, I used to even have a time in our class called Start the Day with a Story that didn't even have any educational agenda. It was just sharing a book with the kids. And that has always just been such a special time with me and the kids. But I think what's even cooler about a project like this is very few teachers who are teaching full-time, working full-time, are like, you know what, I think I'm going to write a book. And so a process like this where teachers, it's more of an anthology. It's a collection of several different stories. And I think that's an honoring process to tell teachers, like, because a lot of teachers are like, well, no, I'm not a writer. I'm a teacher. I'm not a writer. But they are, and they have such powerful stories to tell. So this process of having, inviting teachers to share those stories with us, and how excited they are that it's going in a book, and, that they're going to get to share it and share the love they have for their job and things like that, has really been fun to kind of witness and see. And I've been excited to be part of that.
And I think you're right. I mean, this is our 5th book that we've published, and all the authors have been, fantastic, great people, great to work with. But I just got to say that if there's something that can go above and beyond that, the authors of this book have been that. They've gotten us everything that we need, whether it's a biography or a change or, a clarification or whatever it is, just so expeditiously that it makes the whole process easier. And they are genuinely excited to share the story, because, that they've written, and each other's stories. So many have said already, I can't wait to get the book so that I can read your stories, because they're all good. And I think, something you said there is important, that there's something there for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. The stories are a couple pages long, 5 different categories. So it's almost like a teach meet. If you don't like what's being talked about right now, stick around a couple minutes, because there's something better, in the next couple pages in this case. And I think that's the beauty of it. There's something here for everybody. There obviously are elementary, middle school, high school teachers, but they're also our instructional coaches and principals and guidance counselor. It's so fun to hear an elementary guidance counselor tell a story about puppets. I honestly have a couple puppets of my own, but I don't use them in my class too much. I've made a couple videos with them to explain things, years ago. But this is something she stumbled on. And, years ago, I would have been like, oh my goodness, a puppet story. Mm-hmm. But I can kind of relate to it, because, I've used the puppet. I've seen a puppet. I remember my elementary guidance counselor, Mr. Elmer, something like that. Helmer. He had a dolphin, and that dolphin would come in and teach us lessons. And so here we are, whatever it is, 30 some years later, and she's telling a story about how she found a couple of puppets, and somebody before her left them there. And now for her, it's almost 30 years later, and she's been using those puppets and, adding to her collection, or I don't know, zoo. What would you call it?
A menagerie, I think, is what you call it.
Is that what it is? Well, she definitely took pride in having them. So, see what I did there? Any line?
Is that Barbara? I do. That's Barbara, right? She, we've had her on the podcast before, and she's full of so much energy, and was just the joy that she would talk about these puppets and how the kids would not talk to her, but they would open up to this toy. And it was just fascinating to hear. And I think that's what's so as an instructional coach, when you're in the classroom, my world was my 22 kids, and my team, but my view and my perspective was those children. And I think one of the cool things about being an instructional coach is that I got to be in so many different people's spaces that I felt like I learned more in 3 years than I had in 15 years in the classroom. Like, I was just able to, every time I'd go in, I'd be like, well, I didn't think about it like that, or I've never done that way, or that reading log makes more sense, or that person that doesn't use a reading log makes more sense. Like, I was able to look at how all of these different people operated and what their practices were. And I even feel like that now, like as a coach, my perspective kind of broadened a little bit to that to campus. But then now as in this district position, I put gas in my car all the time. I'm driving all over our district to all these different schools. And just to see the way the classrooms look different, the way the teachers, the way the different principals operate. It's been so, like, I've learned so much in this last, in these last 2 months, just because I'm getting to be an observer. And I think that's kind of what this book does, is it gives you, and even this podcast, I get to have these unique perspectives on things that I never would have gotten to connect with these people, people from out of my state, people from out of the country. And I just feel like every time we have another guest on the podcast, or every time, I'm able to be in some of these Twitter chats and things, I'm like, wow, oh, okay, and for this to be my 21st year in education, I think that sometimes you think, hey, okay, I know all this by now, but I never do. Every day I'm learning something new from somebody else. And they may have taught for 5 years. They may have taught for 5 minutes. I've learned so much from brand new teachers. It's just been such a fun process. So I really do appreciate the way that these different choices, like you said, podcast and Twitter and the book, like there's all these different ways, and people can really kind of find the ways that suit them the best.
Right on. And I think I thought you were going for another analogy there, like a fill your bucket thing, kind of,
Oh no, you're the metaphor guy.
You're filling up your tank with gas with all these different experiences. I think that's your next podcast. Filling up my gas tank.
My tank, yes.
One building at a time.
I do it a lot.
But I think you hit the nail on the head here, and I think all of the books that we've published, again, whether I knew it at the time or I figured it out afterwards, they've all sort of been this idea of, each of us with our nose pressed up against the window, looking inside somebody's classroom and going, hey, let me see what you're doing. Let me see, what's going on in there. What are the cool things that you're doing? And, once in a while, oh boy, I'd never do it that way. But, that teacher can do it that way. I think this is exactly that, right? It's the peer observation, but it's in print. It's these different categories of what have you done and how did it work and what was the result? And that's what each of these stories is about. And I think that's the power of the story, right? This is what happened in my classroom. And that teacher, that educator is an expert in what happened. And this isn't like we're going to hit you over the head with it either, right? This is here's what happened. And here's what I experienced from it, but you draw your own conclusions. Mm-hmm. And if this isn't your story and it doesn't speak to you, then you move on to the next one. And there's 28 other stories that probably will. But I think, there's something there for everybody, and you can draw your own conclusions from it. And I think that's where this book will be best is the idea of a starting point for book studies, perfect for that. So it's got the 5 categories: overcoming obstacles, relationships is a huge one, the hooks that educators use, EdTech tools and successes, and maybe my favorite, the category called That One Kid, because everybody's got that one kid. And so I don't know, maybe that's 5 months of, you read a section a month, or maybe it's a story a week. Are there 29 weeks in the school year? I don't know, every 2 weeks, whatever. But I think that could lead to a great discussion, right? Read the story, talk about it. Have you ever had this experience? What do you think brought that about? How could we create more of those experiences, those situations, those opportunities for our students in our school? What could we do differently? What could we keep doing? What should we bring back that we used to have? Those are all conversations that, a good story, can start that conversation. And I think I think that's where this could go. Sure, you can read it on your hammock on a lazy Sunday afternoon, but I think the conversation that can be started, much like the game of stories and the other things we've done, it starts the conversation so that educators can, wallow in the experiences and the richness of the diversity of what they've done in their 21 years or their 5 years, or, hey, I just showed up and I want to listen, whatever
Right.
it is. I think this is a great starting point for that.
Well, and I have like the ultimate Venn diagram here, but like I was just saying right before you said it, I was like, it's like the card game, because that was one of my favorite sessions that I ever had with educators in my district that I'm friends with, that we, learn from all the time. But we just got together at a local place and we just sat there and we played the game, and people were visiting and laughing and talking. It was so, Ralph Fletcher in his book about writing talks about low stakes writing for kids. And that's what it felt like to me, is this very low stakes PD. Like when you're kind of just relaxed, you're doing your best, you're just getting to kind of be who you are, and it's not mandatory. You didn't have to sign in. It's just this kind of, let's just talk about what we do and what makes it successful, what was terrible, and kind of laughing at ourselves. And there was self-deprecation, there was humor, there was like, oh my gosh, remember that time, and I think all of those things, the things that there's such a humanity in teaching. And I think that whole process is kind of at the forefront of what we're doing here. And I think we find it on the podcast when we're just kind of talking to people, it's not ever really following an agenda or a plan. We just kind of visit. And I think that's one of the things I appreciate about it the most. But it made me think too, back to the writing project and the idea, the Central Texas Writing Project that I work with is part of the National Writing Project. And the idea, the philosophy behind that is that teachers make the best professional developers of other teachers. That when teachers are the ones that are sharing their successes, that we learn more, we learn better. And that anytime a teacher is delivering professional development, it's automatically better, is kind of the idea behind the writing project. It's the way everything is structured. It's the way that that we operate the institutes. And I was part of one the other day, and you've got all these levels. Like you said, you've got kinder teachers, you've got middle school, high school, you've got college professors, and everybody's kind of talking about what they do and what's similar, what's different. But it's one of the things I think the writing project is so successful.
I couldn't agree with you more, right? And that's not only what the Personalized PD book is about and the CHOICE acronym, and the H in the CHOICE acronym is about honoring professionals, but Stories in EDU, an important part is the subtitle, Sail with the Fleet. And it's check it out, bit.ly/stories in EDU1. It's a beautiful cover. And it's Sail with the Fleet, but like any good educator, we have an acronym. SAIL is an acronym for Share an Important Lesson. And so that idea of from every story, or whether you want to call it a parable or an allegory or whatever it is, there's an important lesson in there, or maybe there's more. But that's what we ask the authors to do, is when they're telling their story, think about, what did you learn from this? What could other people learn from this? Because we are our own best professional developers, right? We tell our stories and, our successes and our, current failures, and we learn from them, right? Whether it's, Cheryl telling her story about Brody, who was not having much success in school after he got to a certain grade because there was just too much. And it turned out that he had a disability that it could be helped through sketch notes. And she was an art teacher, and she had a a beginning interest in sketch notes, and she tried that with him. I don't want to ruin the ending for you, but you can guess how this turns out, because she took that lack of success, and she tells the story of how she gave him the opportunity to do it a different way, and it's worked for him. There's another story about the good news call of the day in the relationships part, where this principal, I think he might have been an assistant principal at the time, he started this good news call of the day, and he said when he saw this parent who he had seen pretty much every day in the beginning of the year, after he had made a good phone call home, instead of ignoring him and not, even saying hi, she walked up to him, and they didn't have their ELL teacher there to translate, but he figured out pretty quickly that she was the person that he, talked with on the phone, and they shook hands and hugged, and it was because of that relationship building that they did. And he learned from somebody else, right? He learned from, I think it's Mr. Mark French on Twitter. He learned about this good news call of the day and started using it, and how he's passing that on, so that's that whole amplify part of what we're trying to do here is, this happened, it worked, maybe it'll work for you. Maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you want to send an email, or maybe you want to do it once a week, or maybe you want to have a contest or a student of the month or whatever. But the idea is that, he was trying something to share the good news, and it was working. So all of those little things that we get to share, and they tell good stories along the way. These are, I always tell my kids when I ask them, so what happened when you went and visited grandma? Well, we just did this. Wait, what is that? What did you do? A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then they practice that, because Daddy makes them practice that. But each of these stories has a beginning, a middle, and an end, as it is right now. And I think the next step in that end of the story is what other educators do with the story once they hear it and read it and talk about it.
Absolutely. I'm just so excited to dig into this, and we've heard a lot of stories on this podcast. I'm excited to read more of the stories. I'm excited to continue. We've had some conversations with some awesome people that we're going to be starting to get some episodes out again here soon, now that the school year is back up and running. But this whole conversation reminded me of a quote that I've seen, and I don't know who to attribute it to, so maybe we can find that. But the quote goes something along the line of there's something you can learn from every person you meet. And I think that gets at the heart of this whole project, is that there's so much we can learn from each and every person, educators and not educators. I mean, obviously the educators we're going to have a more direct application, but there's something we can learn from every person that we meet. And it's really powerful and inspiring. And, even if it's not something you can use directly in your classroom, that inspiration is really important as we embark on another school year, which is going to have its fair shares of ups and downs. And when you're having that tough day, crack open the book, check out one of those stories, and be like, you know what, we can get through this, because there's good will happen.
You might need a story about how the Wi-Fi didn't work, so we went and bought a goat. That's a true story. Or
I've read that story.
You read that story?
That's on your blog.
Yeah, it is. I made it better. Brian Kulak saves a life. Kenny Bosch on the first day of school leads what he calls not speed dating, because it's not dating, but it's a get to know you activity. There's the stories about the kids who become, Michael becomes a little brother to this brand new teacher who years later sat at sporting events with his mom and watched. And then, when she sadly passed away, she's still been there for him, because that's her little brother. There's a story there for everybody. even the girl who in my class was going to use technology and it was going to solve all our problems. She talked about Harriet Tubman, the moose of her people. Not the Moses of her people, because she led people out of cat. Nope, that's what it said. She was the moose of her people.
Yes.
So, Jason, where can we get our hands on a copy of this book? Because it just sounds like just an enjoyable way. Even if I'm not a teacher, just to hear about some of these things that teachers are doing, like I'd buy it for that.
Great stories are universal, and
that is absolutely correct. So where can we get this?
Great stories happen to people who can tell great stories. You can get this on our website, storiesinEDU.com, or you can get it on Amazon. A link, bit.ly/storiesinEDU1 will take you right to it. And hopefully you can get it everywhere on every street corner in the near future, because it should go viral. It's a great book with great educators who tell great stories.
All right. Well, it's certainly exciting here for our podcast to be a part of this movement of encouraging and promoting the stories of all of our teachers. And I'm excited to continue to do that work, whether it's in print or in audio or in visual or in 3D
card games.
Card games, yeah, that's my
starting
thing.
a restaurant. We could eat good stories too.
It's an EDU restaurant. There's a lot of ways to go, but before we do that, we have to go, and we will be back before you know it with another episode of the Stories in EDU podcast. So thank you for listening, and we hope that you are inspired to check out these other stories, and of course keep listening, because we're going to keep bringing them to you. So have yourselves a great morning, day, night, afternoon, whatever time of day you're listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you for tuning in to the Stories in EDU podcast. Please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Until next time, thanks again.